Like I'm sure many of you, I grew up a Hulkamaniac. I became a wrestling fan during a period where Hogan was on top of the world. Nationally, he was the biggest star in wrestling. It was the peak of the Hulkamania boom. I had all the toys, the action figures, the wrestling buddies, all that stuff. And all the other personalities as well. Macho Man, Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, Jake the Snake, Million Dollar Man, Mr. Perfect. It was the golden era of wrestling, but Hogan was the guy. And then you see where his career took him over the years, where, the red and yellow stuff started to wear thin. Then he goes heel, reinvents himself. We have this whole other wrestling boom. Then he's back to the red and yellow. Then he comes back to WWE briefly and then leaves again. Then later on TNA, and a lot of really sad stuff later on in his life. A lot of it self-inflicted. And he wasn't the Hulk Hogan that you remember from when you were a kid, right? Rarely does that happen, I think, where when you are a kid, these people that you watched on television or these people that you looked up to, they kind of maintain that image, right? You learn more about them. You learn more about the people behind them. They fall on tough times. They get broke or their body breaks down, whatever the case may be. And it's a very sad story. So I watched this Hulk Hogan Real American Netflix docuseries. I wanted to see what kind of job they would do, what they would cover, what they wouldn't cover. It's 4 parts. I would say it totals around 4 hours or so, give or take, maybe a little bit more, which was not nearly enough to cover all of the aspects of this man's life and career. And there's a lot of talking heads. They talk to a lot of people. It's missing comments from some of his contemporaries who worked with him, squabbled with him, were friends with him and enemies. Macho Man Randy Savage, not around anymore. Andre's been gone for ages. Roddy Piper. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people who simply are no longer around. But they did interview a whole bunch of people. I may be leaving a few out, but just to give you a sense of some of the names. Eric Bischoff. Booker T, Ted DiBiase, Jim Duggan. He's not in there a lot, but he is in there. Bret Hart, Jimmy Hart, Hogan's family members, obviously his ex-wife, his son. Brooke, his daughter, is not interviewed for this, but they use audio from previous interviews with her instead. Jerry Lawler is in there, Paul Levesque, Kevin Nash, Bruce Pritchard, Jake Roberts, Jesse Ventura, Donald Trump. Christopher Lloyd is in there. If you remember that they co-starred in Suburban Commando together, which I'm not afraid to admit, again, in my younger days of fandom, No Holds Barred and Suburban Commando, those VHS tapes were played a lot in my household. So that was cool to see Christopher Lloyd. Dr. Emmett Brown here in this. Werner Herzog pops up in here, the director. I'm like, okay, that was kind of random. Vince McMahon is not interviewed for this, but like Brooke, they use audio from him from previous interviews. There's no mention anywhere in this of Hogan's second wife, Jennifer, who he was married to for over a decade. And I've seen her credited with helping him get clean and sober when he was deep into his addiction. She's not mentioned at all. It's like she doesn't even exist. Kevin Nash, I mentioned that he was interviewed for this. And Kevin Nash has chimed in and said that he was interviewed for about 3 hours. And he went in depth on a lot of topics. And he ended up getting like 30 seconds of airtime in the documentary. And I would imagine it was the same with others that they spoke with, which is disappointing to hear. I understand stuff gets, cut out and edited down for time reasons. But I mean, if you're being interviewed for 3 or 4 hours and they're putting you in there for 25 seconds, you're going to be a little upset. But it featured the last interview with Hogan on camera before he passed away. He sat with them for 25 hours. And he was supposed to come back for a follow-up interview a few months later. And in that time is when he ended up passing away. He had gone in for a neck procedure. There were complications during the procedure. I know there were reports that they had accidentally severed his phrenic nerve, which I believe regulates breathing in the body. I don't know if it was a case of malpractice. There was talk that maybe the family would file a malpractice lawsuit. They still have not done so. Something went wrong during that procedure. And we never heard from him again. We never saw a picture of him. He never posted a video on social media to let people know he was okay because he couldn't. And there were a lot of friends and family members who were covering for him and saying, oh, he's getting better. But the reality is he wasn't getting better. And then he passed away a couple months later. I thought on the whole, the documentary was well done. If you were looking for them to cover the key aspects of his life and career, and the addition of all the home movie footage, a lot of home movie footage in there from Linda, I would presume, it gave an insight into him that we've not seen before. It's just stuff that has never been publicly, visible before. So it was nice. You get to see a different side of him and the family aspect. So that was nice. And I also like the use of music for some of the montages. They use like Real Wild Child by Iggy Pop and Broken Wings by Mr. Mister. Like as a child of the 80s, that was much appreciated. But I felt like the way they synced it up to certain parts of the documentary was very well done. But it is definitely for a more casual audience who may have heard the name Hulk Hogan, or they watched him as a kid, but then they fell out of it. Maybe they don't know too much about the man. It didn't dive too deeply into the negative, but they didn't shy away from it either. Like, you can't not talk about his divorce. You can't not talk about the steroid stuff, the Hogan Knows Best debacle, his prescription drug abuse, the sex tape. Like, that's all touched upon. It would have been nice to have more on his time in the AWA, working for Verne Gagne, which is really where the Hulkamania stuff started. And it's why, and also why he left and what was behind that, and the way Vince kind of, got him like in the middle of the night to come on over. And then that's where the whole national expansion started. But it's a WWE produced documentary. So of course they're not going to give the AWA too much credit for anything. But there were other things also, and I'm going to just kind of jump around here. I'm not going to dive too deeply into anything specific, but this is just top of mind stuff. They showed Hogan when he left WWE and he went to WCW, the ticker tape parade and all that. The very first match he had was that Bash at the Beach match in '94 with Ric Flair. And they put the World Heavyweight title on him. And they're showing Hogan's first match in WCW. And they're painting it as, oh, this is so sad. Like, they have Cody Rhodes talking about like how old he looked, and David Shoemaker is on there talking about how tired the act was. And that became true, as time went on, those early red and yellow years in WCW. After a while, it was just them bringing in a bunch of guys that Hogan could just beat, right? That's where the whole Dungeon of Doom thing came in. And so, yeah, as time went on, I mean, that was true. But like the way they were talking about this here, you would think that this entire thing, like from the moment he came into the company, was just one huge misfire. When in reality, that match with Flair at Bash at the Beach was one of the better matches that he had in WCW and was actually very successful for them. It showed that Hogan still had a lot of drawing power left, even though Vince McMahon had written him off. They were talking in the documentary about how Vince had moved on and he didn't want to use Hogan anymore. I guess didn't see the value in him. And yet he goes to WCW, and WCW sure saw the value in him, and they did very well with that pay-per-view. So that was certainly a choice. Their framing of things, WWE's framing of things, because this was a WWE-produced documentary, right? They were cooperating on this. They gave the director full access to their vault and a lot of footage. So they absolutely had input into this. Their framing of things can be very frustrating. And I'll give the Shawn Michaels documentary on Peacock as an example. I saw that recently as well, and I thought it was very good. But they talk about the Montreal Screwjob, and they frame it in the documentary the way that you would expect WWE would frame it, where it was like this big betrayal. And he was going to the competition. He was leaving them. He was going to the competition, and he was going to leave with the belt and show up on Nitro with the belt. And they have, Bruce Pritchard in there saying that, well, Brett was able to get a deal with WCW. He was our champion, and his final date was going to be in Montreal at Survivor Series. Which is not true. That is not at all true. But it's their retelling of the truth. And it's just stuff like that that just drives me up the wall. But, look, the winners in history, they get to set the narrative. They get to tell history the way they want to tell it. People are going to watch this stuff and they're going to take their word at face value. And they're going to think, well, this must be the way it went down. And in fact, that's not the way it went down. They're leaving out some very important details. And so there was a little bit of that in this documentary as well. When they talked about the SummerSlam 2005 match that Hogan had with Shawn Michaels, they left out some important context as to why Shawn was comically overselling for this guy. And they portrayed it as, well, Hogan was old and he couldn't do much, and so Shawn felt he had to make the match entertaining. Which is not totally untrue, but it is completely neglecting all of the behind-the-scenes stuff that was reported to be going on heading into the match and the games that were being played, which would have been nice for them to mention, right? Just to give it that added context. Shawn got out-politicked by the master. That's basically what happened. He who has creative control usually gets what he wants. And Hogan did not want to do the job for HBK. The idea was that there would be 2 matches between them. I think one of them was, I think the rematch was going to be a cage match the following month, and they would each win one. But Hogan wasn't much interested in running it back again after he won. Jesse Ventura, I mentioned his name. He was one of the talking heads in the documentary. He was great in this and very complimentary of Hogan and his accomplishments. But to leave out why they had their falling out and why Jesse has been so critical of him over these years was crazy to me, considering the potential impact that it had on WWE and really wrestling as a whole, if you think about it, had he been successful in his efforts to unionize the roster. And I'm sure a lot of you know the story, but for those of you who don't, and this is the reason why I think it would have been worth mentioning. Wouldn't be shocked if Jesse did mention it, and that's some of that footage like the Kevin Nash stuff that got left on the cutting room floor. But again, the two of them were very tight. Like Hogan and Jesse, man, they came up in the Twin Cities. They worked for Vern in the AWA. Clearly, they both took a lot of inspiration from superstar Billy Graham and probably a little bit of Dusty Rhodes. And they were friends. And when Jesse left the company, he had issues with Vince McMahon over royalties, and he sued him. And there was a deposition, and Vince had to sit down for a deposition, right? Under oath. You got to tell the truth. But in a deposition, you can have your lawyer ask anything you want. So there was a break, and Jesse said, find out from Vince who ratted me out that I tried to get the boys to unionize. Because back in 86, this was right before WrestleMania 2. There was some event out in LA. Vince wasn't there. And Jesse stood up in the locker room and he tried to convince these guys that they needed to band together and unionize. Jesse, he may have already filmed Predator by that point and got his SAG card and probably knew about all this stuff and is like, well, we should have this in wrestling. Well, the very next day, he got a very angry phone call from Vince McMahon, who somehow found out that he had tried to unionize. And he wanted to know, find out from him, who ratted me out. And without any hesitation whatsoever, the lawyer asked Vince. Vince didn't even blink. He was like, Hulk Hogan told me. And Jesse was floored. He had no idea. He was friends with Hogan for all these years and had absolutely no idea that it was Hogan who snitched on him. And that really changed his entire viewpoint of Hulk Hogan as a human being. And that's really why he was so critical of him for so many years. So that wasn't talked about here at all. But think about it, right? Think about if Jesse's efforts had been successful. And that's a big if, right? Because there have been opportunities over the years for wrestlers to unionize if they wanted to. And clearly they don't, or it would have happened by now. But at the time, who knows? If he was successful, how different things might look. And you could say that Hogan had a direct impact on that, right? That's pretty important. Bret Hart, he was a talking head in this. Also, no fan of Hulk Hogan's. But like Jesse, he gives the man credit where it's due, right? But he also doesn't hold back because Bret Hart has no problem telling you exactly how he feels about people. And he certainly does that too in the documentary. Now, outside of the documentary, there was an interview that the director, Brian Storkel, had given. And I thought it was cool to mention here. He was talking about Bret. Bret is or was very good with like these cartoon illustrations that he would draw in the locker room. And Bret had said that he gave an illustration many years ago that he did to Hogan, and it was signed by most of the roster. And Hogan was, blown away by this, and he thought it was such a great gesture. Well, I guess they found the illustration. It was framed, and it was in his storage unit. This is after Hogan passed away. And Nick Hogan said, yeah, my dad had that picture on the wall, framed for so many years. It meant so much to him. So the director texted Bret to let him know. And he said Bret was really happy to know that because he wasn't sure if Hulk just kind of threw it away right after he gifted it to him. So I thought that was kind of a cool story. They got Trump to sit down for this. He said that they pulled him out of a big Russia meeting. Good to see he's got his priorities straight to be pulled away for this. For such a big get, he didn't offer anything of any real value here. They can say, hey, we got the sitting U.S. president to sit for an interview. Right. So I guess that's kind of cool. But yeah, he could have offered something interesting from his experiences with Hogan. And he just spoke in these very broad strokes, wouldn't do the Hogan finger wag when the producer, whoever it was, kind of playfully asked, hey, you want to do the finger point? And he didn't do it. He didn't do it because he doesn't know what it is. Like, I guarantee you, he has no idea what the finger wag even is. So he didn't really offer anything here. In the last episode, they had Hogan. This was after he gave his speech for Trump at the RNC. He played a voicemail that Trump left for him on his phone that he was obviously proud of, and he was showing it off. Outside of that, there was really nothing there. But it was interesting to learn that Hogan going to TNA was an Eric Bischoff idea. It was something he put together, something he negotiated to save Hulk, who was drowning financially, coming off the divorce from Linda. He had no money. He was broke. But his body was so ravaged by that point, Bischoff would have to help him out of bed in the morning. This man was taking fentanyl like it was candy. He was stuffing them under his gums. He had 300 milligram fentanyl patches on his legs. He had 1,500 milligram fentanyl lollipops that he would suck on. He was in so much pain. He should have been dead from all of the fentanyl that he was taking. Now, they didn't mention the rape accusation against him in 95 by the woman. And I didn't think they would. But in that last episode, when they were getting into the negative stuff and a lot of his skeletons, I was curious if they would mention this. She was a publicist for his Pastamania restaurant. This would have been the weekend before the Nitro debut at the Mall of America. They were in Minneapolis. And, she alleged that she was sexually assaulted. She wanted a public apology. She wanted $1 million. He turned around and sued her and her lawyer for extortion. And then the case got settled out of court. I don't know how much traction that got nationally. I know locally it was a big story. Nationally, it probably made a few headlines, but they squashed that pretty quickly. So that was never brought up here. But again, I didn't think it would be. Nothing on the John Graziano stuff. And I understand that had more to do with Nick than it did Hulk. Nick is all over this thing. And he's portrayed like a saint. And it was a big news story involving the family at that time. And I remember talking about it on the Sound Off. This would have been, 2009. I mean, somewhere around then. And I never looked at Hogan or his wife or his son the same after that. Less so Brooke. I never really had an issue with her. She seemed like she at least had a decent head on her shoulders, unlike everybody else in that family. But this was the story that it really made me angry when I first heard it. And for those of you who don't know, many years ago, Nick was drag racing with his friend. John Graziano was in the passenger seat. And he had an accident. Nick was fine. His friend was not. And his friend suffered a traumatic brain injury. Hasn't been the same. I don't even know if I think he's still alive. I'm not sure, but was never the same after that. And was going to require 24-hour round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. Very, very, very serious injuries. So he ended up in jail, Nick did, for a period of time. And the jailhouse recordings came out, where Hogan was on the phone talking to his son, who was in jail, and he's freaking out. And Nick is already thinking about all these ideas for when I get out. He wants a reality TV deal. We'll call it Reality. And this is how his mind is working. But the really egregious stuff, because you could always argue, well, Hulk was just indulging his son who was freaking out. He was trying to calm him down and put his nerves at ease. But then there's audio on there where Hulk is basically throwing this Graziano kid under the bus and saying, boy, he must have done some real bad stuff, or he must have been a really bad person for God to lay all this shit on him. He basically victim blaming. That's basically what he was doing. His son turned his friend into a vegetable, and they're blaming the victim. And then there were the other racist comments on there where he's kind of joking around with Nick and saying, hopefully we don't get reincarnated as two black guys. And I mean, just really, really like disgusting stuff. That said a lot about that family. And none of this was ever mentioned. And this did make news. This did make headlines. I understand there may be certain things they don't want to talk about or they refuse to talk about. If you want to have their cooperation, you have to agree to leave certain things out. To me, that was a glaring omission in that final episode when they were going into all of the family drama, the Hogan knows best stuff, his marriage failing, the sex tape, everything else. Now, they do cover his racist comments from the sex tape without ever saying what those comments were or giving any kind of context. Like, you would never know if he just said one word or several things that he said, which is what it was. And that's pretty crazy because it colored, no pun intended, so much of the way people viewed him in the last decade of his life. Again, there were just certain things where, okay, this is important enough that we should spend a little more time on this. Him being booed at the Netflix debut when Monday Night Raw came to Netflix in LA. And they do show highlights of it, some backstage highlights, and then highlights of Hogan walking out there with Jimmy Hart and being booed out of the building. And they had Paul Levesque interviewed, and he admitted that he thought there was a chance. There was a good chance the crowd in LA would boo this man out of the building. And he put him out there anyway. And I know Vince McMahon told TMZ after Hogan died that he would never have done that. Like, oh, I would never have put him in that situation in the first place, right? Basically throwing shade at the way that Triple H handled that situation. And Hogan claimed, well, it didn't bother him because the producer asked him, like, did that bother you, getting that reaction? He goes, no, it didn't bother me. And he claimed he looked at it as a wrestler getting great heat. Right? I could have gotten back in the ring and I would have gotten great heat, brother. Meanwhile, Jimmy Hart said that it did bother Hogan. Of course it did. He wasn't out there as a heel. Like, this isn't 1997 anymore. He was roundly rejected by a building full of people as he tried to shill his beer. Like, Undertaker could hardly contain his joy when he first talked about that on his podcast. It was embarrassing. And that will forever be remembered as his final appearance on a wrestling show. But the documentary has the usual Hogan lies and exaggerations that he became known for. Him talking about how Dusty Rhodes was such a big hero of his and influence on him. I'm sure Dusty was an influence on him, especially in terms of his promos. But like the way he talks about this, you would think he was a little kid looking at Dusty on TV for the first time. And like, Dusty wasn't that much older than Hogan. Like, they were that far apart in age. And like Hogan, I think it was his second book, talked about like he was 6 years old and he was looking for like wrestling on TV every week. And his hero was Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream. And like when Hogan was 6, Dusty would have been what, 12, 13? Something like that. Like, it's ridiculous. They talked about the famous story of Hiro Matsuda breaking his ankle in training. Hogan sprained his ankle on the first day of training, and he came back and was trying to work on it. And Matsuda saw it was all fucked up. It was all black and blue and said, you should probably sit out for about a week. And then he came back. To hear Hogan tell the story, he broke his ankle on purpose. He came back 6 weeks later and showed, I want to do this. I'm serious about this. And there were a lot of people who were really fucked up. Like, they would intentionally break people's arms and legs and break bones to try to run them off. But like Jerry Briscoe was there that day. He's told the story at least once before on a podcast and said, no, this is the way it actually happened. But it sounds a lot better if you tell people, oh yeah, this guy broke my leg and I came back. And as a story, it makes for a better story. But he made a comment in this because they showed some highlights of him on the Arsenio Hall show in 91, I guess it would have been, when he lied about his steroid use, when Arsenio and his producers thought he was coming on the show to do the exact opposite. So they were not very happy with him. But in the course of talking about Arsenio Hall, he made a comment about how he got Arsenio Hall his job. Now, I'm going to need Arsenio Hall to chime in on social media and fact check this one, because if I was drinking something when he made that comment, I would have spat it up all over my fucking screen. But one of the more, I would say, honest sort of confessions from him that I can 100% believe, and I agree with it. He admits that he wishes he would have retired after his WrestleMania 18 match with The Rock. And if you think about it, that would have been the perfect send-off for him. And like him and Ric Flair are both very similar in that regard, in that they are two of the biggest names in the history of the business and should have been regarded as wrestling royalty, like right up until the day they died, right? But they each did more to tarnish their own legacies than anybody else ever could, for a lot of reasons, right? But they also didn't know when to let go. 18 in Toronto would have been a great finale for Hogan. 24 in Orlando would have been a great finale for Flair. And it was supposed to be, right? But he's got alimony to pay to like 16 ex-wives, so he had to work and he went to TNA. That's to say nothing of his last match a few years ago where he almost died in the ring. He told Ariel Helwani last week that he had a heart attack in the ring that night. I know he said that before, but he still talks about it like he's bragging about it. Oh yeah, I had a heart attack that night. I had 2 heart attacks in the ring that night. Like, these will be the final lasting images of these men. Hogan being booed out of the building at the Raw Netflix debut and Flair almost croaking in the ring. It's sad. But they are a product of their own choices. Like, nobody is perfect, right? People are flawed. They're flawed creatures. Hogan is no different, but people are entitled to feel the way they want to feel about the man. For a lot of people, they want to look at Hogan, and they will always look at Hogan as this mythical figure that they grew up with. They want to remember Hulk Hogan as that guy from their youth. And you can do that. And that's how a lot of people are going to choose to remember this man. But there are a lot of people out there who can't ignore what they have learned about Hogan over the years. Because guess what? When you get older and you become an adult, you hear things, you see things, you learn things, right? The mask slips a little bit. You learn things that maybe you wish you didn't learn, but you do. And so it's hard to reconcile that person from the one that you now know, but that's life, right? We all learn things we probably wish we didn't know. But you can't run from it. You can't ignore it. This is who he was. I can still look back fondly on those old days. I can go back and watch old Hogan matches and promos. I can give the man his flowers for doing something that no other wrestler has done, right? He ushered in 2 boom periods for 2 different companies 10 years apart as a babyface and one as a heel. And for that alone, he is on Mount Rushmore. But it was sad to see how broken down he was there by the end. We all get old, but we're also not 300 pounds jumping up in the air and crashing down on our tailbone every single night, year after year after year. Especially back then in those old boxing rings that WWF had. They were like landing on concrete. They had no give to them. And by the end, I mean, he was getting around with a walking stick like Gandalf. This man was the face of the superhero era for a lot of older fans. This comic book character come to life with the exaggerated physique and the big muscles. And to see him and so many of these guys later in life all crippled up in pain, it's the antithesis of what we grew up with. And that's a hard pill to swallow when you watch stuff like this. But on the whole, I thought the director did a very good job with the documentary. If you're kind of on the fence about whether or not to watch it, there may be parts of it that you don't enjoy. But I think if you're an older fan or if you were familiar with Hogan, back in the day, I enjoyed the trip down memory lane as far as the earlier stuff goes. I enjoyed some of the home movie footage. And then when it gets into the stuff later in his life, again, I have sympathy for the guy as far as the pain, the physical pain that he was in, which I don't wish on anybody. In terms of a lot of the other stuff that he ended up going through and a lot of the controversies and chaos around his family life and all that stuff. Look, we make choices in life. And sometimes, those choices will come back to bite you on the ass. And in a lot of cases, that's exactly how it played out for Hulk Hogan. The highs were very high and the lows were extremely low. But at the end of the day, he's going to go down as one of the key figures in wrestling history. Again, tied into 2 of the biggest business booms that wrestling has ever seen. He was a very big part of that. And that, in addition to all of the other stuff that came later in his life, that is part of his legacy.